Module Data Governance, Quality, and Controls. This module will comprise about 14% of the exam. Now the objectives will dive into the following areas, which will be security, compliance, data quality, data loss prevention, IRM, and MDM as well. The lessons that are a part of the module will be focused on governance, the data lifecycle, data ownership, data classification, data privacy, data storage access, IRM and DLP. We'll go into a demonstration on DLP being data loss prevention. We'll talk about controls that we can put in place for data quality. We'll talk about how to validate quality. We'll talk about some of the tools that are available for data transformation. We'll get into data security fundamentals. We'll talk about master data management. And then we'll wrap up the module with the summary review and some review questions. We have a lot to cover in the module, so let's proceed on to the next lesson. Introduction to Data Governance. In this lesson, let's talk about the importance of managing data securely with compliance as well. Now, it's important to realize that data governance is going to be what is relatively a strict set of principles that organizations will generally want to have in place to ensure that their data is safe and secure. Now, the reality is that every organization will look at things a little bit differently. However, there's going to be some types of organizations like financial sector or healthcare that'll have a little bit stricter processes in place in general. Now, when we consider data governance, it really should be part of your data management plan. And once again, as a business analyst, a data analyst, this may not be something you even have any input in, but you just want to be aware of where it generally would fit in a lot of the larger organizations at least. Now, data governance also generally is going to adhere to compliance and other standards that the organization will follow. Now, when it comes to key principles around data governance, we're going to want to pay attention to transparency. We want to make sure that the policies are in place and that they're clear to everyone involved. Accountability. This is really simply put as if there is a reason to follow up on something, then you should be able to identify who actually accessed the data, who made the decision, etc. Compliance is really one of those areas that, in general, is going to be a little bit, I would say, confusing to people at first when they get into business analysis and intelligence. But in general, it's really about policies is really a simple way to look at it. So you may not be able to access certain types of data depending on where that data is located, as a simple example. Reusability. Now, this is where we have policies in place that really specify that there should be procedures that actually would be rolled out to the organization and would generally state that this data is meant to be kept in this specific, let's say, type of platform. Now, this may or may not mean that that can go from one platform to another, but it also may mean that we could take data from a data warehouse and bring it into another data warehouse and actually query against it. What would be the benefits of having data governance? Data quality. If we have policies in place that state data needs to be handled in a certain manner, then that should ensure that the data is kept secure, that it isn't manipulated or edited or deleted. And that sort of falls in line with security as well. And we also want to consider privacy, that if we have our data secure, that that data should actually only be viewed by whoever needs to view it, not someone else that shouldn't. Compliance and agility. When it comes to governance framework elements, there's typically, again, a lot that goes into this. And again, for this exam, we don't have to be experts in governance, nor compliance, or framework development, right? This is more just the terms that we want to know. Entity relationship terms. So as we had stated earlier, record linkages is going to be an approach we could use for affiliating one data set with another, or records, I should say. So record being a file, it could also be data sets, it could be even a folder in some cases. When it comes to data constraints, this is where we have rules in place that limit the type of data that can go inside of a database system. Data integrity is really going to ensure that the data is consistent and it hasn't been modified. Now, for those familiar with the IT security best practice around the CIA triad, that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability, then this would make sense, right? So if you're not familiar with it, you may want to take a minute to understand that a little bit more in detail, but make sure at a minimum you understand that integrity is really focused on what? Making sure data is not modified. When it comes to data models, there's three main approaches that we could use when it comes to governance. So we have conceptual. This is really where the data exists, and basically we want to show, for example, how it actually relates to other pieces of data in that database or data warehouse. Logical is really a more detailed view and is going to have additional data fields that we could review and understand. Then we have physical. This is really, again, the deep dive into, for example, here is where this table is, here's a relationship, here are the fields that are part of this table, and other attributes that we want to be aware of. Now, when it comes to practices, there are certainly some things we want to look at around data integrity. Domain, this is a rule that we put in place to make sure that we have a column that is the way it should be, just as an example. Entity, this is basically a rule that we put in place to ensure that we have every row in that table that is unique. So the way you do that is to add a primary key in a lot of cases. Then we have referential, user-defined, and data retention. These are all additional terms that you may run into, but I just want to make sure that are here for you to prepare for with the exam. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Data lifecycle. In this lesson, let's talk about how data is created and then the phases it goes through before it is actually deleted or destroyed. When it comes to data, it has to be created first. So that's the create phase. Then we have the store. That's where we're going to want to store that data somewhere that is typically going to be safe, compliant, and available to the users. So that could be a file store. It could be a database, a data warehouse. Wherever it is going to be stored, we have to maintain it for availability, compliance, etc. Then we're going to be using that data, and we typically want to have access control, logging as well as part of that. Then we may want to share that data. Then we want to archive that data once we're really done using that. We may need to maintain it for compliance. Now, the CSA has a really good overview of the data lifecycle, and I wanted to make it clear that there is no official CompTIA data lifecycle to my knowledge, so we're going to use the CSA one. There's a number of different ones out there, but the best one, the most widely used in the world of data architecture, is really the CSA. So we're going to follow that one, but feel free to use whatever one you're comfortable with. Now, as far as the phases, we do need to know a few of these for the exam, and that's why I have the table here for you. The first phase is always create. In other words, data has to be initiated. And then store, use, share, archive, and destroy. Now, I won't go through each of these. You'll want to take a few minutes to go through them, make sure you understand the process. The easy way to remember the data lifecycle for me is I use a word called crusade. So C-S-U-S-A-D. Now again, it's not exact, but it's enough to give you an idea on what should go before what. So you don't get confused over the third phase, the fifth phase, etc. But again, this is fairly straightforward. You need to spend a few minutes on it, and I want to make sure that you have the table for studying. Let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. Determining data classification. In this lesson, let's discuss the importance of classifying data and ensuring governance. Now, classifying data is going to be a very important step in a lot of organizations, and it's really used to ensure that we have proper risk management, we're meeting compliance, we're identifying data that is important to the organization. So it's really important that we go through these exercises. We're going to likely use risk management tools as part of this. We're going to want to also ensure that data is protected with the proper structures in place. So for example, we may want to use specific frameworks. We may want to have a very specific data lifecycle in place. We may want to use SDLC. Whatever is in place, we need to just be aware that data needs to be classified when we are actually following best practices in the world of governance. When we classify data, we want to make sure we understand what that really means. So classifying data is the process of classifying data assets based on really specific values according to its sensitivity. So what does that mean? Well, generally, it's going to really be based on how important that data is, and also, is that data privacy data? Is it financial data? Is it healthcare data? It comes down, in a lot of cases, to compliance as well. So classifications of data should define two specific areas. That is, first, the type of data. So type of data, is it privacy or non-privacy? Is it financial or non-financial? Is it healthcare or non-healthcare? Just some examples. Now, we could also have, just as an example, it may also be proprietary data. It could be patent information. It could be information that shouldn't be public, right? This is really a type of data that we as an organization need to identify. Then we need to look at a confidentiality level. Is this data something we should have available to the whole company, or only the engineers, or only the business and operations folks, right? These are things we want to look at. Is it only HR, right? These are really exercises that your organization needs to do if they already have it. Ownership. So ownership of data is going to be something that, again, could vary quite a bit based on the company. But generally, whoever creates the data typically owns it. But the reality is when we say own, that doesn't mean that the employee owns the data. It just means that they have sort of responsibility of that data until it's designated to someone else. The company owns the data. When it comes to, for example, a couple other things here, we generally would want to specify data through the data lifecycle, as we had mentioned earlier in the previous lesson. So because of that, there should be some level of designations and responsibility set when data moves through the lifecycle and data ages as well. What are the classification steps? Well, first we need to set the criteria. In other words, create the policy, determine controls, identify the owner, right? As we just said, right? There needs to be some designation here. Document any exceptions, custodian and transfer, and then declassification. So those are really the main steps that are part of classification process. Once again, this can vary slightly based on the organization. If you're in the federal government sector, then this will likely be a little bit more policy-driven and much more detailed. When it comes to documentation requirements, there's some additional terms here I want you to know. You'll likely see a few of these on the exam for sure, so we need to make sure you understand these terms. My experience was that you'll see them all, but your experience may vary. So with that said, make sure you know what they are and be able to identify what is an NDA, what is an AUP, and what is an MOU. Now, some other terms we want to be aware of when it comes to classification specifically. This is U.S. government-focused classifications. Top secret, secret, and confidential. Now, as one who has worked in the sector quite a bit, prior military as well, I have served in the Navy, but I also had the opportunity to serve basically civilian sector customers like the Internal Revenue Service, Homeland Security, Secret Service, and a few others that, again, I could go through the list. But with that said, what I'm trying to get at here is even in the federal government, each of the organizations will have their own little approach to how they classify data. Because of that, you'll need to just be aware when you go into your organization, you'll have different policies to follow, different governance and compliance requirements. This will vary quite a bit, again, based on the sector you're in. Now, what about if you're not in the federal government sector? You're, let's say, working in the civilian sector, or you're based in India, or you're based in Singapore, Australia, wherever. You still, for the Data Plus exam, you will still need to know these. So I want to make that clear. Common methods for handling sensitive data. Data masking, database encryption, tokenization, anonymizing your data, and also bit splitting as well. These are some approaches to actually handle sensitive data. What are some methods for creating sensitive data? For example, data can be created statically when we, for example, mask data, or dynamic can be created on the fly. That's when we add encryption to it while it's being transferred. So some terms, for example, that would match up. Static data is typically data that's at rest. So data at rest. Dynamic data is basically data in transit or data in use. Those are generally considered dynamic forms of data. So with that said, there's a lot here in this lesson, a lot of terms and practices to be aware of for the exam. So let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. Data ownership. In this lesson, there's going to be a number of different roles and terms you'll want to know. And in preparation for the exam, we absolutely need to know these and be able to distinguish who does what, who is responsible for what. For example, the data owner is going to be the creator of the data. They're going to typically determine the classification, the sensitivity level. They're also responsible for CIA. Now, the CIA is what? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, the data custodian, this is typically not the owner, but someone the owner has delegated to maintain the information from a technical perspective. For example, if we have a database, that database may have a number of different tables, rows, columns, instances, whatever. And that information may have been created by the data owner. However, it's maintained by a database administrator. They're the custodian in a lot of cases. So they're responsible for maintaining the operation of the database. So they're really considered the custodian in a lot of respects. Then we have a data steward. So this is a little different. The data steward, and this can be confusing, the data steward itself is really going to manage the metadata, the data itself from a business perspective. They're really, in a lot of organizations, from my experience anyways, they're typically going to be compliance related. Now, this is not always true, but at least from my experience, especially in the government sector, in the financial sector, you're going to have a lot of compliance to deal with. Then we have a processor. This is typically, it could be also the database administrator, it could be a data analyst, whoever is actually going to process the data. They're considered the processors. So are they the ones bringing in the batch files? Are they the ones exporting, importing data? That's your processor. Then there's also a chief privacy officer as well. He or she is the one that is going to be responsible for privacy of the entire organization. So with that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Data storage access. In this lesson, let's talk about data storage types and access requirements. When it comes to the Data Plus exam, be aware that the information we need to know is pretty limited, and I'm only going to cover really what we need to know for this exam. So, when it comes to data storage, what is this? This is going to be storage that we're going to need to maintain from a governance perspective. This is going to be used for backups, for recovery, for audits, whatever that scenario is. Now, this type of storage that we're going to be using could be, of course, in a cloud data warehouse. If it is in a cloud data warehouse, it's going to be on a cloud drive. On the other hand, if it's on-prem, it may very well be on a shared drive somewhere in your network. Now, when it comes to local storage, this is storage that's on your local computer. In other words, your laptop or your desktop. Record linkage. Now, when we link something together, this is going to be typically merging or matching records between a data set or multiple data sets. That's really the main focus for data storage that we want to be aware of. Now, what about when it comes to access requirements? Typically, when we're granting access to resources, could be storage, could be using a data service, whatever it is, we need to be aware of the access requirements. So, if you are a data analyst, you likely probably will not have access from an admin perspective to all the resources in your data stores or your databases that you're using, your data warehouses. This will be a data warehouse administrator typically. However, you want to be aware of permissions you'll need. So typically you may need to have read-write permissions, role-based permissions, or user group permissions. Those are the common approaches that administrators will use to grant access to resources, such as a data warehouse, such as using ETL processes, such as accessing storage, right? This is really the main point that you want to be aware of for the exam. So, if you are granted access to a resource based on your role, such as a database analyst, that is role-based permissioning. On the other hand, if the administrator is giving you write access to specific resources, that may be read-write permissions. On the other hand, let's say you're in a group. That group may be location-based, like in Boston or London or wherever it may be. That user group will be group permissioned. Very simple concepts to be aware of for the exam, but we do want to make sure we understand these. This will be a limited number of questions you may run into, but it is important and very simple to answer once you understand the high-level concepts. So, with that said, make sure you understand the storage types and the access requirements. Let's move on to the next lesson. Data privacy and frameworks. In this lesson, we want to understand the importance of privacy and talk about some of the important frameworks. So what is data privacy? Data privacy refers to how we handle sensitive data. This is including personal information and how it is shared and collected. Data privacy really encompasses ethical and responsible use of data. Now, sensitive data could be anything from health information to cardholder information to even, of course, the obvious, which would be personal identifiable information, such as your name, address, date of birth, social security number, information like that. So protecting personal information is very important, and it's really important as well for trust and compliance for your organization. Generally, we want to implement a privacy framework. There's a number of those available frameworks that your organization will want to take some time determining where you really need to apply and how you need to apply those frameworks as well. And so the way we want to implement privacy is by selecting the right framework and having the right governance structure in place. So when it comes to a data privacy framework, we need to make sure we have the comprehensive guidelines identified. We want to address and adapt the right practices and put them in place. Now, there's a lot of different ones out there, such as the NIST privacy framework, the EU GDPR framework, the California Consumer Privacy Act are just some of the few. But the ones we want to focus on for the Data Plus exam are as follows. The EU GDPR, which is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. This is in 2018. It was implemented, and it's really focused on addressing the EU citizens' concerns for privacy. Now, there's a lot more that goes into this regulation, and to be honest, we don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but we want to understand the EU GDPR is a framework that we may need to follow as an organization. Basically, any data that relates to a person or can identify a person is considered personal data. Now, GDPR also does apply to any personal data that is transmitted and stored. The regulations can be far and wide. If you're an American company, you need to typically follow these regulations if you have European customers. So this is a big concern for companies all around the world. When it comes to payment card industry, PCI DSS is going to be, of course, a standard that any organization that is managing payment card transactions, having to maintain privacy of the card data, will need to, of course, adhere to this specific framework as well. And then ISO 27000 is a very important one. A lot of the global corporations will, of course, abide by this because this is going to be used in a lot of different scenarios. And so depending on your sector, you may actually be very familiar with this. So be aware that 27001 as well is an international standard directly related more or less to information security and management. So be aware that the IEC is really a collection of standards, and then under that we have the 27001 as one of those that we may need to follow. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. IRM and DLP fundamentals. In this lesson, let's talk about what exactly is IRM and DLP, why it's important. It's important to realize for us from a Data Plus perspective that there will be some terms here that may be new to you that you'll likely see on the exam, especially if you don't work in organizations that have these suite of solutions that address PII, intellectual property concerns. So IRM is really a technology suite that is going to protect our sensitive information. This will be protected by using encryption, strict permissions in a lot of cases. Could also be licensing in a lot of cases as well. Basically, this is driven by liability concerns. For example, what happens if someone copies our information? What happens if they steal privacy data? What happens if they take IP, intellectual property? We want to use the right tools as part of this. Now, generally, IRM is considered a subset of digital rights management. Digital rights management is really protecting sensitive intellectual property. So we also want to use the right tools as part of this suite deployment. Be aware, too, that this is multi-layered in a lot of organizations. So you're going to have a different suite of solutions protecting your intellectual property. You may also have a different solution protecting PII data, health data, PHI, you name it. When we consider intellectual property, we want to typically use solutions that identify specific objects, and you'll see how this works when I go into the demonstration in the next lesson. So when we consider IRM, generally there's two types of IP we're concerned with. We're looking at industrial property. This could be our bread and butter if we're a tech company, as an example, financial company, like our software solutions that we use, that we sell, that we maintain on a day-to-day basis, that makes the company money. It could also be trademark and copyright information. Let's say you're a streaming service and you have data that is copyrighted or trademarked from specific artists, right? You have to protect that information so that it's not stolen or used incorrectly. Data loss prevention. Now, this is a tool we can deploy in the organization as part of our IRM structure, our DRM structures, to identify really information that can be a combination of PII data, PHI data, could also be trademark information, whatever we identify as part of the suite that we want to make sure does not get out of the organization or even get into the wrong person in our organization. Now there's 4 types. We have endpoint, network, discovery, and cloud. So endpoint is going to be typically on a node such as a desktop or an iPad, any kind of device. Network is really in the network, looking at network traffic. Discovery is a tool that we typically could install in organizations to search for something. And then cloud is hosted in the cloud platforms that we use. Let's go ahead and now move on to the demonstration with Google Cloud DLP. Setting data quality controls. In this lesson, we want to focus on the importance of quality dimensions. So what is a quality dimension and why would we want to use that as a control? First, a quality dimension is a way we measure how pure data is compared to very specific evaluation and measurements. So, for example, if I'm creating a form, let's say in Google Sheets, or I'm creating a form even in Word or its PDF form, whatever it is, I may want to have, for example, very specific information that is going to be entered, and therefore I need to control that information that's entered. As an example, if it's a date of birth, I'm going to want to have a date with a very specific format. I don't want to have someone enter the date of birth any which way they feel like. So because of that, we need to have what are called quality dimensions put in place to control the type of data. So this is where we ensure data consistency, data accuracy, and another thing that we can enforce is data completeness. So data completeness is basically saying when I complete that form, I need to enter all the information that's required. If I leave a field blank, then that's not good for completeness. Let's say I enter a phone number, but I don't enter the area code of that specific phone number. Well, that's great, I have a phone number, but if I don't know the area code, that could be, possibly over a couple hundred variations of that number. So we need to have the area code and the full number so that I have data completeness, accuracy, and consistency. Now, for quality dimensions, there's a number of these. These are the main ones for the exam. When it comes to additional dimensions we can enforce, it could be, for example, timeliness. It needs to be done by a certain time. Durability needs to last a certain length of time. Or it could be the currency. We need to enforce, for example, to ensure that we specify the right currency or the payment. Is it in dollars? Is it in Canadian dollars? What is it? We could also enforce performance, or we could also have the ability for the user to conform to very specific standards. So these are things that we could add to ensuring that we have the right quality dimensions in our, let's say, our data that we're actually submitting to the organization or providing our customers, whatever that scenario is. When it comes to dimensions, is another term we want to be aware of. It's called attribute data. This is where we're going to define basically a type of data that can be used to describe or quantify an object or entity. For example, if a file is supposed to be CSV, it shouldn't be JPEG. If a file should be, for example, HTML format, and it's XML, that probably won't work, right? So we need to have the right attributes in place as well. Now, we could use Excel, for example, and when we create that spreadsheet, we could also look at the columns and the rows. This is known as tuples. And then we could also consider as well that we can only add one piece of information into that form. We can't add 2 or 3, for example. So there's a lot of dimensions we could really look at, as well as attributes, as part of ensuring that we have data quality and we use the proper dimensions as well as part of our overlapping quality control governance structures. Let's move on to the next lesson. Methods to validate data quality. In this lesson, let's talk about how data quality validation is accomplished. Now, when it comes to validating data, it can be accomplished in any number of different ways. Your organization may very well want to validate the quality of your application data differently than the way they validate spreadsheet data. So with that said, just be aware that it could take many different forms and multiple forms for that matter. So data validation is focused on format and structure of the data. Verification is focused on the accuracy of the data. So this can be sort of confusing, and rest assured you'll likely run into a question or so on the exam about validating and verifying data. It sounds the same, but it is different. So remember, validation is the format and structure. Verification is the accuracy of the data. So for example, if I have data that is supposed to be in CSV format, let's say, make it simple, and it's in, let's say, Excel 98 format or whatever, then that would not be actually validated data. Our organization should actually correct that. Now, what about if I have fields? And let's say I have a table and the fields, for example, are not accurate. Well, I would need to, of course, do what? That's going to make sure that the format of that specific cell, let's say a spreadsheet, make it simple, is actually going to populate date of birth and not, for example, an address or a phone number. So we need to realize that validation and verification are different. This is very confusing to people that might be new. But rest assured, these terms will likely come up, especially on the exam. Now, profiling. When it comes to profiling, we need to be aware of validating results against reasonable expectations of what results should be. For example, when we profile data, and we had spoken about this in earlier lessons, that the data is going to be what? We need to identify the type of data, what it's used for, where it should be located, right? That's really profiling. So we need to make sure that the results match up to what we expect. So, for example, if we're generating data and it should be in English, but it's in, let's say, Spanish, then that's something we need to look at. Cross-validation. This is where we're looking at different data sets and determining, is this what we want or not? We could also peer review and perform audits as well. With data validation of a database, we want to look at, and again, for the Data Plus exam, I would highly recommend you maintain a memory of this. We would look into what? The field level data, the record count, calculations, and visuals as well. So we want to look at all of these different angles to make sure that the data is what we would expect, that we can validate it. Lastly, when we perform data validation, we could manually perform it or we could automate it as well. So when we transfer data between two systems, we want to validate that data. We should be looking at data that when we import it fails, but also look for duplicate records as well. We should always enforce uniqueness as well as part of the validation process. So why would that be? We don't want to have multiple tables of each other. We don't want duplicates, right? If we don't need to. So try to enforce uniqueness. If we try to upload the same file, we need some kind of a warning, right? If, for example, very simple example, if you upload files to your desktop and you have the same name, like download one, it's going to upload that file, but it'll basically append that file with an extension saying it's really a duplicate. So we want to make sure that we have the validation in place to make sure that, again, our data is going to be having high quality and will maintain that quality as well. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Data transformation tools. In this lesson, let's talk about the different tools and methods available. Now, when it comes to data transformation, this is a process of converting data from one form to another. Let's say, as an example, we have a database here and a data warehouse here. I want to ensure that I'm able to bring the dates in from the data sets that I have and be able to query appropriately over here. Let's say our best practice is going to have 8 digits in the date, whereas I only have 6 over here. We would want to, of course, transform that data. Now, there's 4 main methods that we could consider for transformation. We have constructive. This is where we're going to add to the data so that we could meet whatever requirements we have as part of the transformation process. We have destructive. This is where we remove fields or data from whatever data sets we may be running it against. Now we have aesthetic. This is where we are going to standardize the data to meet whatever requirements we have. A common example would be, of course, to look at updating the zip codes or updating addresses. One thing that can come up quite a bit, because storage does cost money, is instead of having fields that allow the user to enter the state in full, or the for example the address, like the road or the highway or street, let's say, you abbreviate it. So over here it's full, but here we have to go and abbreviate that information. Structural, this is where we're going to move things around, combine columns, etc. Now, some of the common tools that we may run into could be Excel. This is a spreadsheet tool. It has calculation capabilities, and it also has a macro programming language built in as well. And all of those are extensions that you could add if you're not familiar with that. Now, we have Tableau. This is a visualization tool we'd want to use in a lot of cases. Power BI as well has a lot of capability built into it as well. And also you go to the Microsoft Store, I think it's called Store on Marketplace, and of course add things as well. Now, RapidMiner is probably one of the more popular ones, one of the more powerful ones, and this is, again, a platform that we could use to basically prepare data, update data, delete data, or modify data, I should say, convert data. So over here, let's say I have data in a very specific form in an older programming language, but over here I need to bring it into, let's say, an R format. Or I want to convert from Python to another language. Now, again, some of this may be done well by RapidMiner. We may want to look at other tools to do that. So, for example, there's a lot of different tools out there like TalentD, Alteryx, Matillion, Datamir, both widely popular as well. So with that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Data security. In this lesson, let's talk about some of the important IT security terms and methods we'll want to be aware of for the Data Plus exam. Now, when it comes to data security, there's a lot of areas we could focus on, but for this specific lesson, we have to narrow it down to just what you need to know for the exam. So the top terms we want to know are listed here, so let's go ahead and talk about them. First is encryption. So when we consider data encryption, this is a process of taking plain text and converting it over to ciphertext. This is a way to protect our data so that if the data is captured, it won't be able to be identified or actually used in a manner that would be inappropriate. So if it is stolen, it's protected. Again, it's very hard to break algorithms, so because of that, encryption is a widely used best practice when we send data anywhere. Data at rest. Now, data at rest is any data that's not being used or moved. So, for example, if it's sitting on a disk drive, then that's data at rest. Data in transit. This is data that is going to be moving from one point to another. So if you're using an application and you're generating data, that data is actually in transit, even if it's just going between basically memory blocks locally. Now, it's also in transit when you're basically using, let's say, a cloud service. You're generating data from your desktop. You're updating Salesforce, let's say, and you're migrating data from Salesforce to a data warehouse, let's say. So that could be just some examples of data in transit. Data in use. So data in use is when the user is actively using the data, generating data. De-identification is a process we would use to basically remove data that could identify someone. As an example, so security numbers, a name. We may want to remove, for example, the last name, but we may keep the first name. So having the first name of someone isn't really a way to identify them when there could be, of course, millions and millions of Johns, let's say, or hundreds in a company. So de-identification is a practice that we would use to make sure that we don't expose any privacy data. A data breach. Now, a data breach is something we may need to respond to if, for example, data gets stolen, it gets copied, modified, or just in general used by someone or accessed by someone that shouldn't have access to it in the first place. Lastly, data masking. This is a process that we would use to make sure that data is not actually seen when, let's say, a user is using an application. Good example. Your Social Security number may very well be in a number of different applications, out from your car insurance company to your bank to your employer. Now, a lot of people may be able to access that, but they may not be able to access your full Social Security number. So when you call in, it'll ask you for your last four or the last four of your account number. Because of that, that data may not be visible by certain levels of access. So it might be, for example, masked out. Another example is if you go to make a payment and use Google Payments, I think it is, in your browser, you'll see the last four of your card number, but the previous, let's say, I think it's 12 digits, would be masked out. In other words, you won't know the digit number. So data masking is also a very important practice that we have to consider as a data analyst. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Master data management. In this lesson, let's talk about what the process is and why it's so important. Now, master data management is a process that we're going to use to standardize our data. Now, we want to be aware that a lot of organizations, and for that matter, probably most that I've been in, still rely on not only one system, but multiple systems. And if we have three disparate systems, they may very well have your information or the product information in it. However, if you refer to three different systems, that information may very well be different. So, from a governance perspective, we need to have MDM in place. The reason is because we don't want to have three different people referring to three different systems and having different information. We want three different people referring to the same system, getting the same information. So it relies on data governance. Very important that it's a top-down structure that's put in place, because you can't rely on the business units, for example, to actually manage this. Because again, they have their own entities. They can't actually tell business unit number one, let's say development or production, to do something different than what they're already doing, right? So it's up to the corporation, the governance structure, the board of directors, whoever needs to specify this will, of course, be aware that as a C-level executive, they can dictate how the company does things. So we can't have the business unit manager handling this. We need a top-down structure. Okay. Now, master data refers to what's called a golden record, and it's a master file. In other words, I'm going to have a master file with the important information that we need that should be the same every time we refer to it. For example, I have seen a lot of different systems in my 20-plus years working around databases, data warehouses, cloud infrastructures, blockchain for that matter. The reality is that a lot of companies will have multiple systems. So, for example, I'll see mining differently in one system versus another system. This is true. A good example is if you call, let's say, a vendor, you have a customer ID number, a customer name, and then you may also have, for example, purchase information from sales, could be support, whoever it may be. Well, that data in System 1 could be different from System 2 depending on who inputted it and how it was saved. Now, Informatica and Reltio are great examples of MDM systems that can be supported really well, especially under a governance structure. How do we create a golden record? A golden record is going to typically be created first by typically a data architect or maybe a data analyst, but typically this is done by someone technical and someone that's enterprise focused that's able to bring together a lot of people. But with that said, every organization is going to look at this differently. So when we consider creating a golden record, we need to have the fields identified. We need to look at missing data. We need to standardize our fields. Now, we also need a data dictionary. So for example, if we're using Excel and we have our data analyst entering information, we need to make sure that every data analyst is going to enter information the same. So I'd like to bring you to an example that's publicly available that is going to reference a data dictionary. Let's go over and take a quick look at it. Now this is an example from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This data dictionary was created for healthcare related information. And so if you look over here on the document, you can download this as publicly available. And you can see here they have different variables identified. So you want to identify the variables. You need to look at the types. Is it numerical data? Is it character data? We need to also describe it as well, so that when I have the next data analyst that comes in and they're getting ready to add to the database, data structure, whatever the scenario is, that they understand how things should be actually referred to. In other words, a data dictionary, for those not familiar with it, is really going to be nothing more than a collection of names, definitions, other attributes that you could identify as well that you're going to use routinely and refer to. So this is sort of more or less a reference document that needs to be created. So that's a data dictionary example. So now that we have our data dictionary, we then need to use the right tools. So we may need to use tools like Informatica. We may need to use additional tools like Reltio or any other tool that is appropriate for our scenario. We may also want to look at governance as well and make sure that we have the right structures in place, the policies in place as well. But generally, too, what I've seen is if you have a process like this for an MDM in place already, your governance is probably pretty good. However, you want to continually maintain it to make sure that things are current. So if you change your data dictionary, make sure that this is updated as well to refer to that update. When it comes to MDM data, as an example, let's say we have sales, product management, and HR. We have different categories put in place. We want to make sure that the data that is referenced is going to be what? Referenced appropriately via the data dictionary. We want to make sure that the data is going to be standardized. So if the data should be numerical, we identify that. If the data is characters, we identify that as well. With that said, let's go ahead and proceed on to the closeout of the course. Module summary. Let's go through a short review of what we covered in the module. We talked about data governance, and we know it's really a set of processes, policies, structures we have in place to maintain security, compliance, etc. in our data environments. The data lifecycle is also critical to understand because there's different phases. There's 7 phases. We have to create data, we have to use it, we have to archive it, etc. Access to data should also be managed. Remember, there's really 3 main approaches to providing access to data. That's going to be via groups, typically as well through write and read permissions, but also could be just a role-based as well. Data validation is focused on the format and structure of data. So we want to be able to look at data validation as really an approach that we can look at the data and say, sure, this data fits our requirements, it's useful. We then want to either look at it as data we could use or not use and then deal with that appropriately. Now with validation though, there's really 3 main methods. We have field level data, record count, and calculations and visuals we want to look at. But of course, there's a lot of other approaches we could consider. Now, verification. So we want to make sure we don't confuse verification with validation on the exam. The terms sound the same, and actually in reality, they sort of sound similar. So with verification, this is really about the accuracy of the data, whereas validation is the format and structure of the data. So validation, format, structure, verification is accuracy. Is the data what we expected? Is, for example, 10 times 10, 100. It's not 92. This is, again, fairly simple concepts, but the terms are very similar and can be confusing. Okay, data profiling. Data profiling is focused on validating results against reasonable expectations and, in a nutshell, really just understanding what the data is and what it's about and does it fit into the organization. Quality dimensions. Now, this is how we can measure how pure the data is and be able to determine the true quality of the data and evaluate and measure it. Now, the types of data that you're going to measure could vary, and how you measure it will vary as well. Attribute data is going to be data that we use to describe or quantify an object or entity. RapidMiner is a widely used data science platform that really is graphical in nature. We could use it to create workflows in reality from taking the data from a source, bringing it through the ETL pipeline, mining it, etc. It's a widely used platform, and we want to know the main purpose of it for the exam. DLP. Now, this is really security tools that we can put in place, and it really is focused on making sure that data does not leave the organization and gets exposed. We want to use DLP, IRM, digital rights management, right, DRM as well, to make sure that we protect the organization from any privacy breaches that could really expose to us really a large amount of liability if, for example, we had a data breach and customer PII data was stolen, right? So DLP is very important. Master data management is really more or less driven by the organization to really determine how data is handled, how systems work together, how exactly does this type of application interact with this type of application. It's really governance and policy driven in a lot of organizations. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Module review questions. Let's go ahead and test our knowledge. We learned about various forms of sensitive data, so this question is really focused in that area. So you've been working at a large investment company. One of your tasks is to ensure that the data that has specific customer privacy information is protected. What types of data would your company likely be most concerned with? So, if you're an investment company, what would be the main types of data that would be sensitive you would be worried about? Well, that would be PII data and also PIFI data, which is financial information. Which of the following terms would define how you would go through the process of confirming that data is accurate and true after it was ingested from an ETL pipeline? This question here, we don't want to confuse, of course, verification and validation is a question asking you about the accuracy or is it quality. We want to make sure we understand that for the exam. Number 3, when it comes to data governance, there's key principles. Which of them would be correct here? That would be compliance. Maria was hired by your company and now manages several data systems. So she's responsible for maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. So what would be the role that she has taken on? That would be the data owner. So because she is maintaining and responsible for that, she would be the creator of the information. The question didn't totally insinuate that, but it did infer to a degree CIA. So just be aware that that's one of the questions that you have to really read into. Now, you have been hired by a U.S. government contractor who is hosting a large database for the U.S. government. the database has been classified at the highest level, meaning that you cannot have any unauthorized disclosure, and if it did, it could cause grave damage to the national security. So what would be the level of classification for this type of data? That would be top secret. With that said, let's move on to the next module. Exam preparation. Let's go ahead and get started in preparing to take the Data Plus examination. Now, this certification is going to be quite challenging, but before you go take the exam, please hold off and make sure you understand the logistics and also go through a short review as well. So let's go through a course summary review of the main topics we covered to make sure we refreshed our memory. We're going to talk about the exam experience and the expectations. So what happens when you sign up? What happens when you get to the exam center? What happens when you pass or fail? We'll talk about the CEU expectations, CEU being continuing ed units that are required. I'll provide you additional resources to help you prepare for the exam as well. And then we'll go ahead and close out the course. We have a lot to cover in the module, so let's proceed on to the next lesson. Course summary. In this lesson, let's go through a short review of what we covered in the course. So we talked about data schemas. They're really more or less a blueprint that describe the structure of our data that we're going to be deploying or have deployed. So when it comes to defining our instances, our tables, even our rows and columns, we generally want to identify the structure we're going to use. Now, the process of creating this schema is called data modeling, and there's a number of different tools out there. A lot of them are based on a markup language, for example, like XML. Dimension tables. Now, a dimension table is going to be a table that's used to store specific attributes that specify what the fact table is really defining. Now, a fact table, on the other hand, is a database table as well that's going to store the measurements, metrics, and facts of specific business processes. A database is what? It is an organization of data that is going to be used for a specific business process. A data warehouse is a repository that we use to collect data from various sources. Now, a data mart is really a subset of the data warehouse. Then we have a data queue. This is a DPU known as a data processing unit that we're using, and it's going to be used to streamline and actually filter basically data from a data mart or data warehouse. Now, a data lake. This is really our raw data pool. I like to refer to this as also really a repository, and it's unstructured. So could be S3 if you're using AWS, just as an example. Just simply create basically a pool of data, and it's raw. You're not really using it yet. It's more of a staging area. We have online transaction processing. This is our database processing. Online analytical processing, that's typically our data warehouses. It's really meant to query large amounts of data. Quantitative data. This is data that's in the form of words, images, or sounds. It's not numbers. Examples would be a name, an address, could be graphics, whereas qualitative data is going to be numbers. Then we have structured data. This is going to follow a predetermined model, sequence, or schema. So this is our relational databases. Unstructured data is data that doesn't have a predetermined sequence. This is typically non-relational data. Then we have semi-structured data. This is going to be data that has semantic tags, but does not conform to specific structures. A good example that would be JSON, YAML, those languages would be more semi-structured. Data fields. This is a specific data reference that is used in a database, and it's going to be where data is stored. Columns. This is going to be used to define the data that is stored in the table. Data profiling. This is where we're going to inspect and analyze our data to determine the characteristics and or quality of the data. For example, is the data stale? Is it accurate? Data cleansing. This is where we're going to remove errors or even redundancy from the data. There's 4 steps to data profiling: discovery, profiling, standardizing, and then cleansing. We also want to be familiar with data outliers. This is basically pieces, or just a piece of data for that matter, that is outside the normal distance that is used in a sample. So if we have a specific mean, for example, and we're 30% out here and 10% out here, and then 10% as well, perhaps, that 30% would generally be considered what? An outlier. Non-parametric statistics. This is basically going to be a branch of statistics that does not make assumptions. Now, parametric statistics is going to be where we're going to make assumptions about how data is distributed. Extraction, transform, and loading, ETL. This is where we're going to take data from various sources, transform it before we load it into the target. Then we have extraction, loading, and transform. This is where we're going to bring in the data, and then we're going to load it, and then we'll transform it after it's on the target. Query. This is where we're going to make a request for data or information, typically from a data warehouse or a database. Store procedures. Now, these are going to be typically deployed via a query template. This is something we may want to do with our local database to basically create efficiencies to pass specific arguments that may not be built into a query. Then we have parameterized queries. These are going to be templates that we add to the application directly. Data manipulation, process of transforming and organizing data to make it useful for analysis. Then we covered descriptive statistics. Remember, this is a set of methods we're using to summarize and describe data that is going to be focused on what? The main data sets. Tendency. This is where we're going to describe the center or the middle of a data set. Then dispersion is going to describe the spread of data around the center. Inferential statistics, on the other hand, are focused on what? Statistical methods. For example, discussing populations, like numbers of populations, income levels, etc. Frequency. So that's going to specify how many times the value appears. The greater the frequency, probably the greater the details of the statistics could be as well. Percentage. This is going to be divided by the total number of values in the data set and then multiplied by what? 100%. What is a data source, right? We know what that is. It's data that we're bringing into a data warehouse, database, etc. Attributes. Now, this is the individual pieces of data that we would have stored in a data source. So, for example, we may have a data source from, let's say, a legacy database. For example, we have attributes. This is the individual pieces of data that's stored in a data source. Then we discussed business requirements. This is really identifying what are the real requirements, the needs of the business for typically specific projects or systems. Business analysis. This is the practice of really identifying what the requirements are for a business. And typically this would be defined in what? A business requirement document known as a BRD. Now, business analysis is a practice where we're going to identify those requirements. We're going to use a BRD, a business requirements document, to specify these. A dashboard. This is an interface tool that's dynamic. and it helps customers, users make decisions on data. Now, wireframes. If we want to design a dashboard, this is really what we use to plan and design the dashboard. We want to call this more or less a blueprint of the dashboard, where we're going to have visuals, where we're going to have our drop-down menus, where we're going to have tables or whatever the requirements are. Mockups. This is an extension of the wireframe. This is used for rendering purposes. Drill downs. This is going to be the data points that we're going to use while we're looking at our roll-up. And then we have an executive summary. So when we're creating reports, we need to make sure that we describe what the report is in a business-focused manner so that the executives will be able to understand what it all means. Quality dimension. This is really, again, a measure of how pure the data is. And then as part of that, we want to look at attributes as well and determine, again, can we quantify them as well. Then we talked about encryption. This is the process of encoding what is really plain text and turning it into ciphertext. De-identification is the process of removing fields so that we don't expose any privacy data. IRM is Information Rights Management. This is a technology platform in a lot of cases that we're going to use for governance to make sure that we have the right systems in place to ensure that our data is accessed and protected in an appropriate manner. And usually as part of IRM, we're going to use data loss prevention systems as well, so that if we have a potential data breach, it can be identified, or even someone accesses the wrong types of data and tries to import or export it when it shouldn't be, this will notify us. Lastly, we talked about MDM, Master Data Management. This is a process where we're going to have standard sets of data, reference data that we're going to use and ensure that all the different parts and users and lastly, we talked about master data management. This is really a best practice around a really well-governed organization that is going to ensure that we have our data referenceable. In other words, everyone's going to use the same data to reference specific information. And typically as part of the process, we need to have what? We need to have a golden record. We need data dictionaries as well. With that said, I want to congratulate you for completing the course. I certainly wish you much success in your careers as well as the test as well if you do take it. And certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn if I could be of assistance. Have a great day and best of luck. Data plus exam experience. In this lesson, let's talk about what you can expect during the exam and also what you can expect as well if you pass or fail the exam. So first, be aware that the exam itself is going to be around 90 questions. Now, these questions will vary based on the test taker, and you may get 90 questions, you may get 92 or 88. CompTIA has their own internal proprietary approach to how they deliver the exams and the number of questions. Now, the reason it won't be an exact number of questions for everyone is because sometimes they're going to put in what are typically called seeder questions. These are questions to gauge how well a question will do, to determine is this part of the objectives in reality, or maybe it's a little bit outside of the scope of what they should be testing on. So you may get a few of those questions. You won't know which ones are going to be actual exam questions that you'll be graded on, so just be aware that you may get a varying number of questions. So the passing score for this exam at the time of writing is a 675. Another interesting approach that CompTIA uses is the scaling approach. Generally, exams are going to be 0 to 100. CompTIA uses a scale of 100 to 900. Why do they do that? Well, they use a scaling system for a number of different reasons. First, they want to make sure that if they adjust, for example, some of the content on the exam, objectives, that it doesn't per se affect everyone taking the exam from, my understanding, an unequal perspective. As an example, you may take specific types of questions and do really well on them, while others may not. Some of the objectives may actually be graded or ranked higher from a point perspective as well. So there's a number of factors from my understanding of why they've been using this, but this has been around since I've been taking CompTIA exams, so it's nothing really new. It's just, again, it's a little different from the 0 to 100 scaling system that most exams would use. Now, when it comes to taking the exam, you're going to first need to provide the testing center, the proctor, information about you. So you'll need to have an ID, and this ID needs to be a federal or state ID. It could be a driver's license. It could be a passport, military ID. Now, for those in the U.S., again, you probably have multiple forms of ID. Now, if you're outside the U.S., you may or may not. I don't know. I just wanted to relate to you that you will need to generally have at least one form of what is called primary ID. Now, the ones that are listed there are driver's license, state ID, military ID, passport, but generally primary IDs need to have a picture and signature, and they're issued by a government entity. Secondary could be a credit card, a debit card with the signature, for example. Also, you will have a photo taken of you at the exam center. So when you check in, there will be a camera at the counter, generally mounted somewhere near the counter, and they'll take a photo that'll be added to your profile. Now, the proctor will check you in and then monitor your progress. It's not an open book exam, so you can't bring your study material with you to use it. Now, the test center should commonly provide you some kind of a whiteboard and whiteboard marker so that you can generally write down things from memory, put things in order, whatever. You can't take it with you. It's erasable. Now, the exam itself will score automatically, so when you basically complete the exam, you either time out or you hit submit, you will get a grade. You'll know that score. If you want to take the exam online, you can do that as well. There is a somewhat different process for getting that ready. You'll need to make sure you download the Pearson VUE test management software that you have to have on your computer. You'll also, of course, need to be in a secure room that's private and quiet, doesn't have a lot of pictures on it. Make sure your desk is clear as well. They are going to check your IDs. They're going to make you move your laptop or computer around, or at least move your webcam so that they can see what's in the room. Then you start the test. You submit the test. You know your score. But with that said, that's really the exam experience. Very straightforward. Remember, it's not open book. The test center will likely provide you some kind of dry erase board. I'm not sure, from my experience with the online, is they're not going to allow you to have anything you write on in the room. So the dry erase board won't apply generally with the online test. But that, again, is something the proctor will have to clarify with you. And then, again, you'll know your score automatically. Now, you'll have up to 90 minutes to answer up to 100 questions. Be aware that there is a survey that is not timed, that's not part of the 90 minutes, but there is a survey that they request you fill out. The interface is going to be simple and intuitive. There's really limited amount of capability in the interface, so you can't go out of it or anything like that. Now, the questions are multiple choice or scenario questions with multiple choice answers. So, for example, you'll get a choose one, choose two, what's the best answer? The exam is going to be pass or fail, as we know. You will get a score report. I forgot to mention that as well. Now, once you pass, you will then, within typically 5 business days, obtain an email from Cert Metrics that will validate your contact information. You will then, once you validate that information, you should receive what's called a fulfillment package from CompTIA with your certificate, and you'll have a couple things in there such as the certificate, a digital badge link, a wallet card as well, and then also a little, pamphlet on how to leverage your certification as well. With that said, the exam experience is fairly smooth from my experience, and hopefully it'll be for you. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Certification CEU requirements. For those that would like to maintain your certification past the 3 years that it's valid for, you'll need to subscribe to the CEU requirements. Now, the CEUs for the Data Plus at the time of writing is 20 units. So be aware that you'll need to submit certificates of completion, maybe blog posts you've written. If you've written a book, you can submit that. If it's related to data, there's a lot of different things that you can submit to once you pay your $50 per year fee. So be aware that there is a fee to maintain your certification. So to be clear, the certification, whether you pay the fee or not, once you pass it, is actually good for 3 years. Now, if you want to extend that certification past 3 years, you'll need to pay the $50 per year fee and submit your CEU units. Hopefully that's clear. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. Practice, exams, and additional resources. Now, when it comes to additional study material, please definitely check out the options available. You may have additional questions, ebooks, etc. on the platform you're viewing the course on. You may also go over to our website, techcommanders.com. We have a blog on Data Plus. There's probably 30 or 40 articles just on different subjects on Data Plus, so check that out on our website. Also, too, I have additional practice questions on Tech Commanders. Udemy.com, we also have content there. Kindle, we also have an exam guide that is also being released in, I think it's late January, early February of 2024. And then also currently available on O'Reilly will be the CompTIA Data Plus Guide short course with practice questions. So with that said, definitely consider the additional resources and practice questions. Let's move on. Thank you for joining the course. I wanted to personally thank you for taking this course and completing the course as well. I do hope you're able to take the Data Plus certification and pass it efficiently and be able to obtain that certification to add to your LinkedIn profile. I would definitely appreciate a shout out if you felt the course was useful, and also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or techcommanders.com if I could be of assistance or if you have any questions. Have a great day. Thanks again for joining.